Hey everyone, it's Peter with the Garden Family, and I started these tomato plants 6 weeks ago, and in this video I'm going to explain the entire process. We're going to cover starting them from seed, potting them into bigger containers, fertilizing, watering, and lighting. So let's go back 6 weeks ago when these two were just tiny seeds. All right, it's day one. We're going to be sowing our tomato seeds today. I'm going to sow a San Marzano, which is an heirloom paste tomato. Things we're going to need for today: we're going to need something to sow them into. I like to sow them into these to-go containers that have a built-in humidity dome, but if you don't use these, you'll want to just put them in a normal pot and probably put some saran wrap over the top to keep the humidity in. You're also going to need some sort of seed starting mix. I use this Pro Mix here, but anything you can buy at a big box store should be fine. And then of course something to water it in. Let's fill our container up with some mix. So I'm just going to fill this up with a little bit of mix. It can be relatively loose. Sowing our seeds is pretty straightforward. We're just going to grab our seeds from here. I only want one of these plants, so I will sow 2 seeds just to make sure I get one. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a little indentation. A couple indentations there, maybe 1/2 inch deep. I'm going to place my seed in. I'm just going to firm it back over with the soilless mix. Put my extra seeds back in the package. Now this is pre-moistened, but it's not that wet. Yeah, I need it to be just a little bit more wet than that. So I'm going to water right where the seeds are and just get a little bit more water in here. These don't have drainage holes, but I can tell by the weight, because I do this so often, how much water I want in here. You don't want it totally saturated, but you want it pretty wet. I'm going to put the humidity dome back on. And since this is a heat-loving plant, I'm going to put it on an 80-degree heat mat. All right, it's Wednesday, February 7th. I sowed the seeds on Saturday, February 3rd, and they just germinated, so here they are. They were on the heat mat and they had the humidity dome. I just removed it. You do want to remove that as soon as they germinate. And then I'm just going to put these under my fluorescent lights. They're a little less intense than the LEDs. They produce a little bit more heat, so it'll stay in there for a few days. I'll give you guys an update then. All right, it's been 14 days since we sowed the tomato seeds, and let me show you what they look like now. So here they are, and they're in our little to-go containers. Today we are going to pot them up into bigger containers. Generally the time when I want to do that is when they have true leaves. So these little leaves right here, these are the cotyledons. They're the little leaves that come out right when the seed germinates. But these leaves are true leaves, so that's about the time I'm going to pot them up into bigger containers. And so what we're going to do is get these out, kind of tease out the roots, and then we're going to pot them up in here. So I'm going to kind of break this apart. We'll see if this decides to just come off. That's the problem with filming things real time. And there you can see a lot of the roots there. And just going to kind of let this fall down here, and I'm going to see if I can get these teased apart. Yeah, pretty well. There's 2 tomatoes there and a nice root structure down below. One of the things that you might see on your tomato seedlings is they might be a little leggy, and what leggy means is they're just a little bit taller than you want them to be. And if that's the case, one thing that's really nice about potting them up is you can pot them to a deeper depth and they'll grow new roots along the stem here. So we'll do that a little bit with these. I wouldn't call these too leggy, but we'll pot these up just a little bit and I'll show you how I do that. These are old hosta containers. They're 1 quart. I think it's a 4-inch square here and maybe 5 or 6 inches tall. This will be the final size of the pot. So this is the last time we're going to pot them up. So I just got my soil there. I'm going to make a hole. They've got pretty long roots, so I'm going to make that pretty deep. And then this part's going to be, you can see these roots here. So I'm going to get them in there. And then I'm going to pot this a little deeper like I just said. So I'm actually going to take some soil around the base and then gently firm it down. Good, so you can see it looks a little shorter compared to how it looked before. Let me get the other one done. So same thing here, just going to fill this up. Relatively loose at first. We're going to make our little hole, and that goes pretty deep down in there because I want these roots on the plant to go deep into the container. So we're going to pot that in there, get it to about the level that you want. Now if it's trying to sink in, you can hold it with the cotyledon. So you don't want to hold the tomato plant by the stem. Remember, it only has 1 stem. It has to keep that stem for its whole life. These cotyledon leaves are temporary leaves. So if you need to hold it by something, hold it by the cotyledon. If it gets damaged while you're potting it up, that's no big deal. If the stem gets damaged, then that is a big problem for your plant. So that is the potting up of the tomatoes after 14 days. I'll get you guys some updates as we go along and see how they grow over the next month. At that point, they'll be ready to go in the ground. So here are the tomatoes a day after transplanting. I have them under the higher powered LEDs, but just for the first 24 hours or so, I've got them under just a little bit of partial shade from these larger parsley plants, but I don't see any wilting or anything, so I think they're doing great. All right, it's been exactly 3 weeks since we started these tomatoes from seed, and let me show you what I'm doing with them now. So here's what they look like after 3 weeks of growth. They're looking really good. This one's just a little bit ahead of this one, but both plants I'm very happy with. They're both relatively compact, meaning they're getting new leaf branches pretty quickly, so they're not leggy, which is what happens when they don't have enough light. Got a nice thick stem that's relatively resilient, and part of the reason is I'm making sure to keep an oscillating fan on them to just give them that sense of needing to be able to resist the wind, so when they go outside they won't be too surprised at how harsh the outdoors is. So besides adequate light and ventilation, I just wanted to talk about 2 other things: watering and fertilization. And they really go hand in hand because I use water-soluble fertilizers for my seedlings. You have the option of organic versus inorganic fertilizers. For indoor plants, I actually prefer inorganic fertilizers. They're less stinky, just a little bit easier to use. I only use organic fertilizers outside because I'm trying to build a healthy soil ecosystem. But indoors, I don't really care about a soil ecosystem in these small little pots. The easiest way I've found to fertilize my seedlings is to just use a really dilute fertilizer with every watering. So what I do is I take a water-soluble fertilizer. I think this is Jack's. I don't have the label anymore. The main thing you want to do is look at the label on your fertilizer. It'll generally have a different amount for outdoor versus indoor plants. And what I do is I take the amount used for indoor plants and I actually use it a third of that concentration. So for example, for indoor plants with this fertilizer, I need a teaspoon in a gallon of water is what it recommends to fertilize every 1 to 2 weeks. So what I'm going to use is just a teaspoon of this in my 3-gallon watering bucket and have that even more dilute than what they suggest for indoor plants. But instead of fertilizing every 1 to 2 weeks, I'm just gonna always use this water for every single watering that I do. So I'm not gonna water these because they don't need water yet. I test that by just feeling the weight of the container. They still have some weight to them, so they still have adequate water. But I'll show you with another plant what I do. I bottom water all of my seedlings. All right, I'll just water these basil plants as an example. So I'm just gonna place them in a tray. It can be right in your 10-20 trays, or I also like having a smaller little Tupperware container just in case I only want to water 1 or 2 plants at a time. And basically, I'm just going to pour a couple inches of water in here. You can see these plants are pretty dry. They'll actually float a little bit if they're dry. But just give them a second and they will stop doing that. And I'm just going to let these sit usually for about half an hour. Now you don't want them to sit in there forever. And then you just take them out and put them in a dry container. Remember, all of the water does have that extremely dilute fertilizer in it, and I just do it for every single watering. All right, so those are the plants at 3 weeks. I'll check back in next week and show you where they are at 1 month. All right, it's March 4th. These tomato plants are 30 days old today. I'm gonna give you a closer look on how they're doing, and then I'm gonna go over the lighting that they've had. I'll start from where they were in the beginning and what they're under now. So here they are, pretty nice looking for 30 days from seed. This was the one that was just slightly bigger than the other, but this one's cut up pretty well. Both tomato plants I'd be pretty happy with. I have seen just a little bit of purpling under the leaves. That can sometimes be a sign of a nutritional deficiency, but I found in most cases it's really just the artificial lighting and the environment that they're in. And even when I've seen that, the tomatoes haven't had any problems once they've gone out in the garden. We've had some unusually nice weather here in Southwest Ohio, and so we've actually brought these out a couple times. This probably spent a few hours total in the natural sunshine. And I have seen some of the foliage up top is no longer having a little bit of that purplish color. So speaking of lighting, let me just show you what we use here in our grow room. So for the first 2 weeks after planting from seed, I actually had the tomatoes under these T5 fluorescent lights. If you remember, they germinated 3 days after I planted them. I took the little humidity domes off and I placed them under these lights, and I kept these lights just about an inch away from the top of the plants. As you can see, that's sort of the sequence I use for a lot of my seedlings. These lights do provide a little bit of heat, and they're less intense than the high-powered LEDs I have over there. And so I found that the really, really small seedlings do better. But once they have their true leaves, I move them over to the higher-powered LEDs. So for the last couple weeks, the second half of their 1 month lifespan, they've been under these higher powered LEDs. These are the Vipar Spectra XS 4000. And I bought one last year and actually bought 2 more this year because I've been pretty impressed by them. They're pretty expensive. I think they're about $350 to $400 each, but I have seen significantly improved vigor and less legginess and just health of my seedlings growing them under these. They also seem to be less prone to transplant shock because the amount of light output is more similar to what they're going to get outside. And so I found the hardening off process to be quicker under these lights. All right, so that wraps it up for the 1 month update. I'll check back in one more time in a couple weeks to show you the final size with 6 weeks of growth. But to be honest, I really wouldn't want a tomato plant much bigger than this to be potted out, which is part of the reason I start my tomato plants more towards the end of March, beginning of April, for a plant out date of the beginning of May. It's day 32, and I know I told you I would keep these tomatoes in these pots their entire lifespan, but these are really getting too big for their pots. I watered these this morning. They're completely dry already, and that's a pretty good indication that they've outgrown the pots. So I'm actually going to pot them up into just a slightly larger pot. This is also going to give us a chance to look at the root structure of this plant. So we can see it's already basically outgrown the pot. We're already starting to get a little bit of root bound here. And so that's actually one of the issues with starting your plants too soon. They outgrow their containers, and then, what do? You end up with a less healthy plant. So let's go ahead and get this into a bigger pot here. These pots are almost the same height, so I just put a little bit of potting soil on the bottom, and then I'm just going to fill around the edges. All right, now that they're potted up, just kind of bottom water. Now that they've been potted up, we'll check back in a week and see how they've grown. All right, we are 5 weeks in since we started the tomatoes from seed. Let me show you what they look like now. So both the plants are doing very well. I did end up potting them, even though I said I probably wouldn't, but their roots were just completely overfilled in the containers. And you can see pretty large plants. We'll give them 1 more week just because I said we were going to do a 6-week total. But these are already a little too big for what I would want to transplant. We'll get you back in 1 week to see the final size. Well, here are the tomato plants after 6 weeks of growth. Just really beautiful plants. They're thick, they're stocky, they're not trying to flop over. So just as a summary, we started these in the to-go containers, and we used the Pro Mix for both the seed starting as well as the potting up. They germinated after 3 days, being on an 80-degree heat mat. We ended up potting them up at about 2 weeks into the larger containers. For the first 2 weeks, they were under the T5 fluorescent lights, and then for the last 4 weeks, they were under the higher powered LED lights. And starting when we potted them up at 2 weeks, they were given a dilute fertilizer with every watering. So I would say the biggest takeaway from this 6-week tomato plant experiment is it really solidifies my plan to not start my tomatoes until early April for an early May plant out date. Now, while these tomatoes are beautiful and look great, and I wish all my tomatoes could be this size when we transplant them, I just don't have enough room for the number of tomatoes I want to grow to be this big. And if we look back at the size these were at 4 weeks, they were a lot more appropriate. They were in the smaller pots, and I could support all the tomatoes being 4 weeks old, but not 6 weeks old. Unfortunately, being mid-March and still almost 2 months before we can plant these out in the garden, these plants are not going to make it out. So say a prayer for them and thank them for all the knowledge they gave us in their short 6-week lifespan. If you made it this far, go ahead and give us a thumbs up down there. And if you like this type of content, consider subscribing to our channel. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Happy gardening, everyone.